Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. Welcome to this webinar hosted by the Middle East Council on Global Affairs. My name is Mark Owen Jones, and I'll be moderating this discussion on navigating the digital frontier, cybersecurity, and geopolitics in the Middle East. And I'm really lucky, and we are really lucky, to be joined by a superb panel. Today, we've joined by Bassant Hassib, who is an assistant professor at the University of London branch in Egypt, James Shires, who's co-director of Virtual Roots, and Anwar Reis, who's a PhD researcher at Nishantasi University in Istanbul, specializing in international relations and international law, with an interesting specialization on cybersecurity. As I mentioned, I'm Mark Owen Jones. I'm a non-resident fellow at the Middle East Council and an associate professor at Northwestern University. Just a bit of house rules first before we go into our discussion. If you have a question for our panelists, and of course we encourage people to ask questions, please use the Q&A function. And there's also a live translation option button if you hit that if you'd like translation into Arabic. But without further ado, let's go ahead with our panelists. First up, I'm going to ask a question to Bassant, again, who's authored multiple articles in cybersecurity. Bassant, cybersecurity and AI in the Middle East, right? Post-Gaza developments. That's what we're going to be looking at first. What are the key cybersecurity and AI threat trends that have emerged in the Middle East since October 2023?
Hi, Mark. Thank you for the introduction and for moderating this interesting webinar. So if we do a mapping of the key trends in cyber and AI threats since October 2023, we can basically identify certain new elements. The first element is that we have witnessed an increase of the multiple threat actors that are involved in the war. In addition to the traditional state-sponsored cyber attacks, hacktivism has played an important role in the war in Gaza, with multiple pro-Palestinian or pro-Israeli cyber threat actors. The thing is that the main platform in which hacktivists coordinated these attacks was Telegram. Of course, other platforms, but their main platform was Telegram because it provided them with anonymity, quick communication, and so on. And because there was an absence of end-to-end encryption across much of the platforms of Telegram, it means that they could technically be compelled as Telegram to moderate and give the governments access to the users' activities. And this is potentially was the reason why governments, they paid attention to the CEO of Telegram because of this potential access. And this shows the role of private technology companies in such conflicts. And of course, in addition to the scale of hack and leak operations and defacement operations, one of the most used cyber attacks is the distributed denial of service attacks, the DDoS attacks. Basically, it means taking down websites with targeted sectors on both sides, not only media websites or government sectors, but also local and international NGOs websites, those NGOs that are offering civilian services to Palestinians. And then the main trend here, or something that was really came at the forefront, was cutting off or reducing internet connectivity. And internet infrastructure here have emerged or have become more visible as a core element in the tensions in the Middle East in general, and in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict in particular. And because Israel, of course, has a complete control over the Gaza Strip, this included the internet infrastructure. Which means that it could be intercepted at scale. And the effect of that is immediately on media reporting of the conflict and the streams of images, videos, and live updates on the casualties, because it ceased during the outage. And this disruption of the internet and the targeting telecommunication infrastructure helped in the dissemination of online disinformation campaigns, as it became harder to access first-hand information and to conduct proper independent investigations and fact-checking. And here regulators worldwide, they started to call out companies like X, Meta, TikTok, and YouTube for not doing enough to curb disinformation that followed the attacks. And the thing is that this information war was also powered by artificial intelligence. And this is what we call the deepfakes. And we've seen in some cases that photos and videos have been created by AI from scratch, especially those including babies, children, and women. And these actually fake images were offered as evidence or justification for the ongoing escalation. Here also, artificial intelligence was used in content moderation and what we basically started to know as shadow banning or demoting content. And a lot of people in the Middle East, and especially civil society actors and organizations, they started to report that their Meta specifically started to shadow ban their pro-Palestinian content by the algorithms, and their posts no longer become visible to other users on the platform. This actually highlights the long-standing concern about unequal, unfair, or unbiased over-enforcement of IA-based content moderation. The other trend here, which became very visible, is the trend of doxing, okay, which is people start to publish your personal information online without your consent, often with malicious intent. And we even see that there are certain websites like the Canary Mission, for example, that are dedicated solely to dox individuals who are actually critical of the aggressions, especially pro-Palestinian individuals. We can see them, those targeted individuals are students, activists, and even academics. And the result of this is catastrophic on their livelihoods, and even reach to death or personal threats. The last point or the last trend or threat that I'm going to mention is the threats that are associated with cyber and AI-powered weapons for combat, surveillance, and intelligence, both by state and non-state actors. Here, the issue is that drones, they have a cyber vulnerability, and it could be detected and taken control over. Also, they could be like hacked for disruption of function or carrying out any unwanted attacks or even for espionage. And because states, most of the states in the Middle East, they depend on foreign AI expertise and techniques. And this poses threats to those states' sovereignty, and which they can become subject to the regional policies of the countries who own the technology. And most damning is the risk of the potential loss or control over their own military technology. And of course, the war also revealed Israel's advanced military capabilities. And on top of these capabilities is the offensive capabilities of systems that we very famously known as Habsura or Lavender or Where is Daddy, which are systems that actually accelerates the selection of targets in Gaza for bombing and provides estimation of the number of deaths in advance. This resulted in an unprecedented scale of civilian casualties and destruction. Here, this is something that revived again the debate on the ethics of the use of autonomous weapons and robotic armies in warfare. And the big question mark is who should be held accountable? And this is something that has not been resolved on the international level in terms of regulatory regimes of artificial intelligence in warfare.
Thank you so much, Basant, for that really important introduction into the kind of states of play when it comes to cybersecurity and AI. Just a quick question, actually. You mentioned disinformation, and I just want to know, is disinformation now seen as a cybersecurity issue? Sorry, you're muted.
Yes, Mark, it
Yeah.
is.
Okay.
Because we need to clarify that when we talk about cybersecurity threats or cyber threats in general, we're not only looking at the narrow scope of cyber threats in terms of compromising ICT networks or technologies or systems, but we're looking at the broader scope of cyber threats that also includes compromising the safety of the ICT users from online data violations and harmful content. And this information is a harmful content to those people.
Yeah. I mean, I've heard both, and as someone who studies disinformation, I personally see it as a cybersecurity issue too. I know some people don't, so thanks for clarifying that. Um, we've looked now at some sort of far-ranging issues here, but one of the other issues that I think it's important to get a handle on initially is the notion of cyber security alliances or cyber alliances, right? And I think Anwar, you can talk to us about this. How are evolving cyber alliances, particularly the US, Israel, and Iran-allied coalitions, reshaping power dynamics and security calculations in the Middle East, right? Because often people rely on getting technology or expertise from other countries. So, Anwar, how would you answer that question?
Initially, I would like to thank the Middle East Council for hosting this webinar, and special greetings and thanks to our colleague, Professor Fawzi Rawaidi. for making this possible. Coming back to the question, let me just briefly highlight where these evolving cyber alliances are coming from. So the Middle East has recently experienced a rise in violations of the principle of sovereignty, just as Professor Hasib just mentioned. So given that state sovereignty is a key national security concern, and following that these actions also fall under the realm of cyber sovereignty of the states, we have witnessed states prioritizing cyber sovereignty alongside initiatives for digital transformation. So we are speaking about a mutual interest of security protection that aligns with political shared common interest here. So as for the US, Israeli and or the versus the Iran allied coalitions, I believe we understand that where is this formation and the question coming from, because it also has a very strong political background. So, but we have to make it clear that it's not just about US, Israeli versus Iranian allied coalition issue. It could be shifted and reshaped according to the geopolitical tensions and conflicts that emanate. But also, after they emanate, they also form themselves in this coalitions and alliances, because it's also geopolitically bound. So definitely here, I think it's relevant to highlight the example of the cyber attack against Gulf states in the summer of 2012, known as Shamoon. It demonstrated the severity of such threats. So this software targeted the Saudi Arabian national oil company Aramco, resulting in data loss on thousands of computers. The incident served as a wake-up call for Gulf states. And after that, we observed relationships, and we observed that the United States specifically established a cybersecurity protocol with the United Arab Emirates to outline collaborative efforts on digital resilience. So conversely, recent cooperation pacts between Iran and Russia, also focusing on cybersecurity and information technology, presented the fresh challenges to the United States as objectives in the region. And because of that, of course, we see the alliances in various conflicts before in the Middle East, particularly in Syria, Lebanon, Palestine. So it's with respect to many security actions. But I would like to strongly state that these geopolitical alliances should not justify perpetuating global laws and principles like sovereignty, like human rights, because we've seen Israel violating and attacking, for example, Lebanese sovereignty and in many other aspects as well. But I mean, not under the justification of geopolitics or Iranian political conflict in other states. So these violations are turning to a mess in the region, violating all of the main principles. The ongoing regional conflicts and the instability, of course, exaggerated the cybersecurity risks, but we've been seeing how cyber attacks are being utilized as tools for warfare and coercion. But from an international law perspective, I believe that these actions shall be organized under a global convention structure as well, for states to protect their cyber sovereignty as well, and for future warfare, which is absolutely at risk at this point.
Thank you, Anwar. I mean, you mentioned, for example, Saudi, learning lessons after that attack, and then this US UAE cybersecurity alliance. But there's also the opportunity for rogue engagements within this, right? There's the example of dark matter, where you had former NSA agents working with the UAE to engage in hacking. I mean, how do you position those kind of relationships? Are these entirely informal? They state
Well,
sanctioned? I mean, how does this fit in with the cybersecurity relationship?
absolutely. Sometimes you see that these are private companies, but at the end of the day, they're also functioning and followed up by states and governments. I think legal-wise, it could be critical to actually get the proof of that. But at the end of the day, looking at it from a geopolitical perspective, we can see why these coalitions are being formed, and what's the shared common interest that it's up there.
Mm. I mean, I think you've also
Well,
highlighted we need transparency as well, because often we find out about these things
absolutely.
because, people get caught, right? So I think it also reflects on sometimes the secretive nature of a lot of these deals. Thank you so much, Anwar, for that. We're going to sort of go a bit deeper now into the Gulf. You talked about Saudi Arabia, and we talked a little bit about Iran. James, I want to talk about the role Iran has played in shaping at least perceptions of the security landscape. With regards to the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council in particular, I mean, what role has Iran played in shaping the trajectory of cybersecurity policy and capabilities in the region, in the Gulf states in particular? And I know you've written extensively about this. I mean, you have a book on cybersecurity in the Gulf in particular.
Sure, I'll try not to go through all of that in a
Don't,
few
don't
minutes.
worry, you don't have to do all of it. You've got 5 minutes
But
to explain.
thank you, Mark, and thank you to Middle East Council for hosting this fantastic webinar, and pleasure to be on such a wonderful panel. I'll start just by talking a little bit about uh, the different kinds of cyber threat, both coming from Iran as a perpetrator, but also faced by Iran as a frequent victim or target of these threats as well,
Right.
because I think that dual role is essential to understand the place of Iran and the perception of Iran by the Gulf states. The other thing that's worth saying is that cyber threats and cyber operations and hacks don't occur in a vacuum, right? They are only ever part of geopolitical dynamics, whether this is the war in Yemen, the more recent war in Gaza, Iranian strategies of defense through proxies or asymmetric conflict. And so all of these cyber operations are happening in that context, right? And we see this not only between the Gulf states, but also instances where you have disruptive or destructive cyber operations being carried out by the US or by Israel in response to kinetic operations such as drone strikes by Iran. Right? So cyber operations don't happen in a vacuum, they happen in context of other conflicts. Going in a little bit more deeper, we can see the kinds of cyber threats posed by and faced by Iran in 3 different ways. First, these destructive or disruptive operations. Second, operations aimed at gathering and often leaking information and intelligence. And third, kind of information or influence operations. And again, to tie back to your original question, this is why we have to consider disinformation and influence as part of the broader cyber landscape. Anwar very helpfully mentioned the Aramco operation as a key disruptive operation starting over 13 years ago now. We also have the original cyber weapon Stuxnet as a starting catalyst as well. But to fast forward through history, you have a continuation of these disruptive and wiping operations on critical infrastructure in the Gulf states, often attributed to Iran or proxy actors, behind which Iranian state actors are attributed, and those continue throughout the last 10 years, well after Aramco. They then also have what is often seen as a shadow war, right? A cyber war carried out under the sort of threshold of kinetic operations between Israel and Iran, well before the Gaza war, when this comes into sort of open conflict. And this includes destructive operations against critical infrastructure in Israel and Iran, and again, proxy actors like Predatory Sparrow, this supposed hacktivist group, taking down railways and fuel stations and steel mills and that kind of thing in Iran, demonstrating the power of cyber operations to cause damage to a country's critical infrastructure. Now, for the Gulf states, that demonstration could very easily be reflected back on them, right? They're very dependent on oil and gas infrastructure. This infrastructure is highly digitalized, and Iran has good access to that, often for intelligence purposes. So they are very vulnerable to Iranian cyber intelligence collection. Now, as Iranian economic and political instability increases over the last few years, you have major protests within Iran and popular dissatisfaction. You also have greater influence of sanctions. You have Iranian cyber operations diversifying, right? Going into what's known as ransomware, holding data for ransom, and then otherwise leaking it if someone doesn't pay. And it's unclear what's going on here, right? Sometimes you think, okay, these are Iranian actors, and that's the sort of easy way of describing this threat. It's an Iran threat, just in the same way you have Russia and China and the big 4 cyber threats. But really, it's a little bit more complicated, right? You have groups maybe affiliated with institutes or universities or private companies working on behalf of different state entities, the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or the Ministry of Intelligence and Security. It's an internal and an mainly external organizations, and they have different priorities and goals as well. So when you see these different actors working, you have to work out which is the Iranian state organization behind them and what is their strategy there. And then you even have moonlighting, right? So sometimes the ransomware operations conducted by Iranian actors are not badged as Iran. They're not even sanctioned or I guess, directed by the Iranian state, right? They're also just trying to make money on the side. And as cyber criminals all around the world know, a very easy way to make money is to ransom, to leak people's data. And so you have this interaction between disruptive operations on one side and intelligence operations on the other side. And the Gulf states are trying to defend against both at once. They're trying to invest significantly in cybersecurity capabilities, often relying on Western or global threat intelligence firms and cybersecurity firms really ramping up their cybersecurity defenses, but also combining in international initiatives such as a counter ransomware initiative. And this is one where actually you see very close cooperation between Israel and the UAE in developing a threat intelligence platform against ransomware as part of a broader coalition of states. The final thing I mentioned here is to go back to this idea of influence operations, right? Iran is also being targeted extensively by various propaganda and narrative efforts from within the Gulf states, from outside the Gulf states, trying to undermine the Iranian regime, right? This is a stated objective of some of its adversaries. And they're also doing the same back, right? So you have this famous cyber operation against the presidential election campaign of US President Donald Trump last year, right? And a whole load of US critical infrastructure operations by Iran in the same time. Some of these are not that sophisticated, right? So some of them have PDF downloads saying, download your network security guide here, right? And you click on the network security guide, turns out it's actually not a network security guide. So some of it's quite sophisticated, some of it's not that sophisticated. Watch out who you're talking to on LinkedIn, for example. That's another common social engineering method by which you get these influence operations, and a lot of companies have published extensively on that as well. So you get this overlap between influence to hack and leak operations to cyber operations designed to spread a particular narrative or propaganda as well. And this is all coming together in the perception of a cyber threat from Iran and the cyber threat to Iran as well.
I think, I mean, thank you so much for that, James. And I think there was all interesting, but I really found the concept of the idea that sometimes with cybersecurity or cyber attacks, right, it's not necessarily always that this clear state orchestration. There's these different groups operating in it. And I like the idea of moonlighting here. I mean, that sounds like an article right there, moonlighting in cyber on hacking or whatever, but really interesting. I mean, the question I have here is actually, I mean, I have two, but I'll stick to one. You talked about ransomware a fair bit. And are ransomware attacks also part, you mentioned all cyber, much of the cyber warfare and hacking happens within the context of a larger geopolitical conflict, whether it's hybrid warfare or not. Is ransomware also part of that? Or is that a separate threat done by criminals, for example?
It certainly is, right? I mean,
Yeah.
the reason you have large centers of ransomware and cybercrime coming from, for example, the Russian language region is because the Russian state turns a blind eye, right, and almost encourages ransomware outside of its borders, right? So there is always a geopolitical element, even to cybercrime, right? In the Iranian case, actually, it's a little bit more sophisticated, right? Ransomware doesn't happen just by one group or one particular cyber criminal sitting by the computer. It's actually a whole chain of actors in commercial relationships. Someone might get access to an organization. They then will sell that access to someone else who then deploys some ransomware. They decrypt the data. Someone else then gets a payment and gets that payment out and then pays people on the chain. So it's kind of a whole ecosystem going on.
Right.
And what I think you see with the Iranian actors is actually the decision to become a cyber criminal, right, to use ransomware, actually isn't made until very late on in the process, right? Actually, what they're starting with is saying, okay, can we just get access to this organization in Saudi Arabia or in the UAE or in Israel? Once we get access to the organization, let's decide what we do with it. If we find some really interesting data that's useful for the Iranian intelligence machine, maybe we'll take that back as a classic espionage operation. If we find data that's maybe sensitive and commercially valuable, maybe we use ransomware. If we find stuff that is more useful for propaganda, we'll just leak it online and do an influence operation. So actually, not only do we as analysts not know what they're doing in advance of the plan, neither do they. Right? And they're being very flexible and improvising depending on what they get access to.
It's somewhere between a marketplace and a warehouse where you store your wares for later, but also you can buy and sell these goods. I mean, fascinating. And just one thing I want to reiterate that you mentioned, and I'm glad you did, for our listeners, many of whom will be extremely savvy. And you mentioned the LinkedIn example of the dodgy PDF. These don't have to be sophisticated, right? We're going to be talking about AI and infrastructure later, but sometimes it doesn't take much to fool someone. And there's been numerous examples of that. So I think as much as we talk about increasing sophistication, sometimes old school manipulation of trust.
Just on that, so you
Yeah.
have this whole sense of sophistication, right? Where most people put Iran now is in commodity malware, right? You can buy and sell malware and use it for state aims. The benefit of that is that no one knows who it is, right? If anyone can buy the malware, then you don't know it's a particular state attributed behind it, right? And these dodgy PDFs and these LinkedIn messages, they're also combined with quite complicated techniques, like DNS tunneling is another one, right? How do you get infected computer to call back to its command and control center? It's actually not that easy, right? There's a lot of ways of detecting those kind of communications. If you hide in basic internet protocols like the domain name system, people can go and read up more about this. That's actually a very common way for Iranian actors to make sure they continue to have control over infected computers all around the world.
Oh, wow. Okay. Thank you. And we have some specific questions about Iran coming in the Q&A, which we'll ask at the end. But just a reminder for any of you watching, if you've got any questions for our panelists, please use the Q&A. We're going to move now to the notion of infrastructure, which I think is a natural segue from this. And I know Basant and James, you've written together on this, but Basant, I want to come to you. I mean, you talk in a recent paper about the economic and geopolitical consequences of digital infrastructure, using terms like diplomatic lubrication and digital recognition. Could you talk about what you mean by these things?
Yes, Mark.
Hmm.
I just want to comment on something what James said. It's
please do, yeah.
fascinating. It's very fascinating how ransomware works. And it actually is the question of how do you actually identify attribution, or how do we claim attribution? This is a very hard question. With the complex system that you said, James, about how ransomware works from different actors. So how can we trace back attribution? This is the question that's in my head, which is I don't have the answer for that. But it's something that came to my mind that when James was making his comments. Now back to your question, Mark, about public infrastructure and what we mean by diplomatic lubrication and digital recognition. What we tried to do, me and James, is we tried to show how do digital technologies contribute to state cooperation as a form of formal or informal state recognition. And here we coined the term digital recognition. And by digital recognition, we refer to the influence of digital technologies with their operators and owners on state recognition. And we examined three aspects of digital technologies here: cybersecurity, cloud computing, and submarine cables. Of course, in the context of UAE-Israel cooperation before and after the Abraham Accords. We did it to illustrate the new ways in which states, they recognize each other in the digital age beyond the traditional legal status or legal recognition. And what we mean by diplomatic lubrication, which was your question, it means that states, they start to use digital technologies, and the private sector companies that own and operate these digital technologies as tools to navigate around and overcome hard diplomatic relationships and to build momentum moving towards recognition. And it happens through directing private security, cybersecurity sales towards outcomes that is beneficial for national security objectives for states, and at the same time, diplomatically favorable to both of them. As Anwar mentioned, for both Israel and UAE, there is a common cybersecurity threats coming mainly from Iran, which presented new vulnerabilities for both of them, which actually forced them to rethink their security posture and their traditional cybersecurity or security partners in general. And as Anwar mentioned, these new cyber threats and new cyber technologies, they are actually going to forge new cooperation dynamics or new alliances in the region, other than the traditional alliances that were previously existed. And here, cybersecurity companies on both sides, UAE and Israel, they started to develop products and services to help them to effectively overcome or combat these cyber threats. And by doing so, they are acting as practical or practically implementing or demonstrating cooperation and rapprochement. Of course, this cooperation initially was done informally. It was like an informal recognition by Emirates of the Israeli state's identity and capacities, digital identity and capacities, of course, because of its unparalleled cybersecurity power. And here we can see United Arab Emirates, these sought this cooperation in order to obtain high-quality cyber offensive products and services. For example, the NSO's spyware Pegasus. And for Israel, these actually considered UAE as a market for its cybersecurity sales. And at the same time, they saw this cybersecurity sale as a diplomatic leverage. So it then translated into legal recognition with the Accords, which then enabled them to have further cyber security cooperation, but in the cyber defensive market. For example, right after the Accords, UAE and Israel, they jointly announced the project Crystal Ball, which is a platform where they can detect and repel attacks through their common sharing of intelligence and their collaboration on sharing information. The other aspect here that I'm going to talk about, which we mentioned, is infrastructure. And here what we mean is that states here who are involved in transnational internet infrastructure projects, together they develop technical working practices, interests, dependencies that facilitate the diplomatic recognition and cooperation leading to diplomatic recognition. In these projects, both the states and the companies, they recognize each other's value as useful internet transit points, and of course, for the companies, commercial consortium partner. Now, what does this mean in simple terms? It means that digital infrastructure projects act as drivers for cooperation between states and diplomacy, and also between states and technology companies by aligning their security and economic interests. On one hand, we have the states benefiting from exchanging best practices, gaining access to the technological expertise and know-how, fostering their capacity building through skills, training, education, and so on. At the same time, companies are driven by, of course, commercial incentives and competition between the companies in order to participate in such cooperation in this public-private partnership. And in the Middle East, we have the two very famous examples. We have the Trans-Europe Asia System, TEAS, cable project by the American company Centurion, with landing stations in Saudi Arabia, UAE, Israel, and also passing through Bahrain, Oman, Qatar, and Jordan. Also, we have the Google Blue Ramin cable, which actually goes through Israel, Jordan, Oman, and also Saudi Arabia. These integrated fiber optics cable or internet cables, they would actually enhance the high-speed internet connectivity and promote cooperation between them to maintain this resilient connectivity. This means it will include cybersecurity cooperation among the involved states. In addition, these internet cables, they will permit those states to participate in global cloud computing or cloud architecture, providing them the necessary data speeds for the high performance of cloud computing that is needed. Now, how or why does this process happen? It happens because there is a sort of a spillover effect of the digital infrastructure projects, in which cooperation in one digital aspect of a project would lead to cooperation in another, further strengthening diplomatic ties between the participating states. This is because the various aspects of digital infrastructure are extremely interdependent. Why? Because, for example, when you have cloud computing, cloud requires both a resilient internet infrastructure and also cybersecurity for data protection. At the same time, internet cables, the data cables, they require also stability and security. And so both of them actually require cybersecurity technologies for data protection and resilient connectivity. So everything is interconnected. One type of cooperation and a digital aspect will automatically lead to another. And here technology companies would be central in both incentivizing and practically implementing further cybersecurity and digital infrastructure cooperation. Here, this will require cooperation between the involved states and technology companies to start to harmonize their cybersecurity measures and standardization and regulations in this regard. So this is how it works.
I mean, super interesting. I want to come back to that, Basant, but I just want to, before I come back, I'll ask James for his input too, because you both wrote this paper. So, James, is there anything you want to add to that? And then I'll have a couple of questions I want to ask you both.
Sure. So, I mean, Bassam gave a great overview of the paper.
Yeah.
I'll just highlight one aspect. This is that we focus on what we call digital recognition, right? The ways in which digital technologies change states' ability and incentive to recognize each other, not only through formal means, but also informal means as well, right? And here, states don't have it all their own way, right? Bassam mentioned a lot of ways in which they are reliant on companies, cybersecurity companies, infrastructure companies, and so on, right? And they're also making really difficult economic security decisions that have a trade-off implicit in them. So in cloud computing, right, you want to have access, especially for AI and computation required for large language models, to have access to the best cloud computing, the highest performance cloud computing available. But you also want that data to be localized, right, to be held within national borders, to have some kind of digital sovereignty, right? And those two desires are essentially in tension. Cloud computing companies will say, yes, we can meet all your demands. We can build new data centers, right? You can have a whole cloud region in Qatar or in the UAE or in Saudi Arabia or in Israel. But actually, you do sacrifice performance, or you do sacrifice the ability to have data at the edge of the network and to have resilience to targeting maybe particular data centers as well. So they're always balancing these trade-offs between national security and digital economic participation. And that's where these dynamics of digital recognition really come out.
I mean, this is a question for you both, I suppose. I mean, you talk about digital recognition, and I found this theory particularly interesting. It's not like this kind of recognition can necessarily happen through any forms of trade. You know, if I want to buy 1 billion pistachios from Israel, not that they make pistachios, it's a bad example, but if I didn't have official diplomatic relations, I would go elsewhere to get my pistachios. Is the reason that the security, in terms of cybersecurity, is it because this is such a niche area that, for example, the UAE and Israel are forced to, not forced to, but there's very little alternative in terms. They both have a shared security objective, but also there's very little else. There's nowhere else to go in terms of getting the level of technology that can be provided, right? Is that what's special about cybersecurity that allows this digital recognition in a way that trading other items can't? Even military technology, more conventional military technology, is that too visible, for example? Would that come with too many legitimacy costs for a country who would be seen to be, for example, an Arab country buying Israeli weapons? What's special about cybersecurity technology that allows this? And that goes to both Basant and James. And
I could start
Yeah, sure.
with,
Go ahead, Bassam, please.
yeah. Yeah, as you said, yes, the role of technologies, mega projects in state self-image and recognition is nothing new. But when we talk about digital aspects, cybersecurity or digital infrastructure or cloud computing, it's different from other large projects, okay? Because here states, they just want to plug in, especially in terms of cable projects, okay? Quite literally, okay? They want to have plug in to data flows over the global internet, thereby conforming to the internet's open standards, protocols, and the governance structures that come with them. Okay, and here we have a cooperative rather than competitive, okay, approach that makes them work together. And this is something unique about cybersecurity, as I mentioned, because, or not only cybersecurity, all kinds of digital aspects. One thing will lead to another. And I will tell you an example that we didn't actually mention in the paper. Something might make it more simpler. You know, the IMEC corridor, okay, the India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor. It has a lot of digital connectivity aspects in, okay? And these digital connectivity aspects actually demonstrate how it is economically and diplomatically significant for the countries. For instance, for example, the first thing is that the integration of the digital payment ecosystems, okay? So we're not talking not only about cybersecurity, cloud computing, and internet infrastructure. I'm going to talk about all other aspects of, or other digital aspects. Digital payment ecosystems of the countries that are involved in the projects are crucial for them for achieving more effective and efficient trade objectives, and particularly for fast payments and remittances transfers. And this digital payment infrastructure requires both robust cybersecurity to protect data privacy, safeguard against financial fraud, ransomware, compromises of prepaid credit card information, hacking, and so on. Okay, and these unified payment interfaces, which was actually initiated by India, started actually to be adopted by all other countries. Okay, started with UAE, Saudi Arabia, and France, for example, as part of this project, which would necessitate cybersecurity cooperation between those states to secure their fintech-based fast payment system. Second, also, they will have the subsea data cable, which was one of the objectives of the project. Again, this cable is essential for supporting the digital infrastructure of these countries. And as I mentioned before, why and how it works. Also, there is also the upgrade of telecom networks from 3G, 4G to 5G mobile broadbands, which is something that is a key component of the digitalization efforts in all of these nations, okay? So now states are looking for a secure and trusted and affordable telecom hardware as an alternative to the more cost-effective 5G technologies offered by Chinese companies like Huawei. And this will require cooperation on the level of national and private telecom companies of the states involved. And this is why cybersecurity, cloud computing, any kind of digital aspects are important for these countries, because basically everything now is digitalized. Your economy, your whole systems are digitalized. And it's essential for them to have cybersecurity, to have stable internet connections, and so on.
Okay. Thanks, Bassam. That really helped. James, is there anything you want to add to that?
Very quickly, so within that broad picture of states wanting to access global connectivity, the national security implications and sensitivity of cybersecurity are relevant, right? And in a couple of ways. One, the kinds of technologies you use to detect cyber threats in an organization, in a company, can also be used at a national level for security purposes, right? If you're monitoring, if you're filtering network traffic, you can do that at a national level for censorship and for monitoring, or you can do it in a company level to stop your employees accessing Facebook. It's the same technology, but it immediately has dual use implications, right? National security and legitimate security, other security uses as well. There's also a cultural aspect as well, right? In Israel, especially, you see cybersecurity companies coming out of the military, coming out of intelligence organizations, right? They're already baked in to the military national security culture and apparatus, and then they carry on that attitude into their commercial interactions. So when you have people that are formerly intelligence agents or military agents selling cybersecurity solutions, they're talking at a state-to-state level, even if they're not representing states. And in the other direction, you mentioned dark matter already, right? That comes out of this US UAE counterterrorism cooperation, right? Sharing data on the biggest kinds of national security threats. And then like, well, how do we hack into these terrorist data? How do we hack into other people's data, right? And then it snowballs from there, right? So there are these very much overlapping national security dynamics around cybersecurity that do make it distinct from pistachios or anything else.
Yes, no, I said pistachio. It's on my mind for some reason, but yeah, I mean, I really find that. I mean, Israel is a really interesting example because of, like you said, the not revolving door, but the garrison state thing, where you have a highly militarized society, people leaving that. And in the case of dark matter, for people who were trained in security services coming out and going into the private sector, of course. So you get those interesting dynamics. And we've mentioned Israel a lot now, and Anwar, you've been waiting patiently, and I think we're going to be talking about now. I suppose in a way, cybersecurity in the context of occupation, because Palestine offers a very specific and interesting model when it comes to talking about cybersecurity. And I think that's really interesting to talk about, because we've been talking a lot about geopolitical and regional dynamics, especially with Israel being, what I call maybe a digital superpower. It has this ability to use digital technology to pursue domestic, regional, international control. But let's talk about specifically about Israel's control over both Israel, but the occupied territories, right? How has Israel's control over telecommunications and internet infrastructure shaped the power dynamics of cyber warfare between Israel and Palestine, right? Particularly in light of reported 3 billion cyber attacks since October 7th, 2023. Is that correct? 3 billion?
Yeah, thank you. To fully understand this case, it is important to consider the long history of geopolitical tensions in the region, because Israel has had conflicts with neighboring countries for years, but it holds a strong advantage, mainly because it controls the telecommunications and internet infrastructure in Palestine. So Israel's control over the telecommunication and internet infrastructure there creates an unequal power dynamic with serious effects here. So, however, due to the ongoing oppression, the Palestinian cyber teams have managed to carry out hacking operations as a state of defense against Israel, targeting military computer systems. So while Palestinian cyber capabilities are still developing, the ongoing conflict has pushed Palestinian groups to adapt by using basic but effective cyber tactics, such as hacking and social media operations, to challenge Israel's strong capabilities, let's say. So even though there's a clear gap, these operations show how important cyber warfare has become in today's geopolitical struggles, and the scale of the cyber attacks show how intense the cyber conflict is and the growing size of the digital fight here as well. So these are not usual incidents of technical disruption only, but they are strategic efforts aimed at challenging technological dominance.
From the Palestinian side here, you're talking explicitly.
I mean,
Yeah.
the Israelis have had this power since before even October the 7th, and now this should be a kind of cyber technological defense in order to deter the dominance of the challenging technologies. So this creates a unique paradox, let's say. So while Israel's control over the infrastructure places it in a position of cyber supremacy, it also places a spotlight on the effectiveness of Palestinian cyber resistance, let's say.
Mm.
This structural inequality highlights also the order, and it has we can read from there the broader geopolitical struggle in the region, and also it challenges and questions the cyber sovereignty that has emerged as a critical battlefield here. And it's really important to understand the Palestinian situation. It's a complicated geopolitical challenge that is also questioning in so many aspects human rights. And
But I mean, you mentioned, I mean, this is like really interesting because people don't necessarily think about, I think when you think about the occupation as well, you think of total Israeli dominance in many spheres, including the cyber. And we talk about examples now of Palestinian resistance in the cyber domain. Do you see any alliances with, I mean, do Palestinians have support in that domain, the cybersecurity domain, like alliances, international alliances? We talked earlier a bit about alliances, like US, UAE, and or Russia, Iran. What about for Palestine? Do they have sort of logistical support, technological support in that domain?
Of course, as you just mentioned, the occupied territories. Maybe speaking about that while also mentioning sovereignty might make it a bit complicated to understand the aspect, of course.
Yeah.
The Palestinian encounters unique sovereignty dilemmas and challenges due to its geopolitical nature and all of the Israel's attacks and the dispute around these areas. But what distinguishes Palestine from other Middle Eastern countries it's the political environment that consistently is jeopardized by Israel over time. So when we speak about violations of the principle of sovereignty, it also applies to the cybersecurity method. And as I previously mentioned, and taking a comparative case study between the Middle East and let's say the European Union, specifically while looking at the Ukraine war, Russian war. So both regions face geopolitical pressures that push them down detailed studies really show how the European Union need to have these cooperations and alliances, but that are actually influenced by external actors. But at the same time, they have to prioritize making their own independent way of defense. So I think this is applicable here also in the Palestinian case. Is there or is there not? We can see, according to what has been announced in the recent attacks, we've heard about this union of hackers around the regions and from different states. So I think, of course, they've been kind of supported. They've been supported by other individuals from other states, but there's no announcement of any government of any other state. It's just kind of a joining the resistant movement in a global cybersecurity field. So But I think by strengthening the cybersecurity mechanisms independently, Middle Eastern countries in general, I'm speaking like in generally speaking, so to be prepared for the next level of cyber warfare that we have been seeing, and it's already started, but day by day it continues progressively to increase. I think all Middle Eastern states should work more on protecting their sovereign cybersecurity. Now,
Sorry, I mean, sorry, Anwar, I just wanted to ask on that note before I forget, because you're talking a little about recommendations for the future, right? And what Middle East states should do. But, and specifically the Israel and Palestine, how do you see that changing in the future though? Because I mean, it's been described as Israel's been described as using Palestine as a laboratory for its cyber warfare, for honing its cyber skills, right? What does that actually mean for Palestinians in the future? I mean, we are talking about an asymmetrical thing. We're not talking about the same level field. And do you see Israel continuing to use Palestinians as a testing ground for their cyber technologies, or do you see that dynamic changing somehow?
Thank you. Thank you for your question. I
Hmm.
mean, current asymmetries in cyber capabilities between them are severe, and they are likely to worsen in the upcoming years with serious consequences for digital sovereignty because Israel has targeted Palestinian communication infrastructure, including social media, telecommunication networks, using advanced technologies such as AI bots and machine algorithms. So this has raised serious human rights concerns. Specifically, we were able to see that during the military operations in Gaza. So Israel undermines Palestinian people's digital sovereignty by using AI tools to prevent them from accessing critical information. Not to mention how they were used in attacking and using really AI-developed machines to throw
Yeah,
bombs.
yeah,
And
Bassam mentioned has water, for example, and Lavender, these specific technology, AI assisted technologies, right? Um,
over
and
the coming years, while Israel is likely to maintain and further strengthen its technological capabilities, Palestinians' ability to counteract this digital imbalance is less clear. But currently, Palestinian cyber capabilities are limited, and we were able to see how they were able to defend all of these cyber attacks with basic possible tools. But I mean, I think it's gonna continue to be asymmetry. And that will not only affect the physical territorial control, but also define the broader struggle for political autonomy and digital rights in an increasing interconnected world. As these technological issues advance, global attention efforts to protect human rights under this attacks should be more focused on, and especially in conflict zones. I think, as Professor Hassib mentioned, we really need legitimate legal aspects and solutions for
yeah,
solving this issue.
thank you so much, Anwar. I mean, just before we go on to the sort of question about the GCC future directions, what governments could do, James or Passant, do you want to mention anything about the case of Israel and Palestine before we go forward, or any reflections on what Anwar has just said?
Sure. I think there's an important point here, especially from those who study cybersecurity and cyber conflict, right? That
Mm.
for a long time people thought, okay, well, how will cyber capabilities be used in conflict, right? And people didn't have very many examples, right? And then the main one that propped up was the Ukraine war, when right, it looked like you had major state actors on a relatively, not an even playing field, but a traditional battlefield using cyber capabilities on both sides, right? And the question is, okay, how are these affecting battlefield operations? As Anwar says, right, this is a completely different context, right? The Gaza war is one where Israel is in occupied territories, right? It has complete surveillance access, it has complete telecoms access, right? It has extreme asymmetries, not just of power in terms of bombing and airstrikes and military power, but also in the cyber domain as well. And this kind of extreme asymmetry is something that that will repeat again and again, and wasn't addressed and wasn't really thought about in terms of cyber conflict before this war. So it really challenges people to say, okay, no, how do cyber capabilities provide opportunities not only for domination, right, but also to weaker actors in this context, right? And the answer isn't clear. Right? If you have a territory effectively majority reduced to rubble, right? With people struggling for food and aid and all the basic lifeline things, right? You're not talking about cyber capabilities in the sense of like website defacements and stuff like that, right? That's a very peripheral issue
Right.
for this conflict, but it's got an oversized importance for cyber conflict scholars, right? So they need to recalibrate what they should really be focusing on within conflict.
Right, yeah. I mean, and also just it's interesting bearing in mind, like despite the asymmetries, is that, October the 7th happened also in part due to an intelligence failure. So despite the cyber capabilities, it doesn't mean that some form of avoiding that, what seems like a very all-encompassing net isn't possible, right? So it's also an interesting kind of thing to think how people adapt to that sort of surveillance and that cyber kind of security. Thank you, James, for that. Basant, did you have anything you wanted to add on that?
Maybe I'll add something on the laboratory
Yeah.
pieces. You mentioned something on laboratory, and I
Yeah.
think
The Palestine laboratory is.
yeah, and someone from the audiences also asked something about the lab thesis. I just want to clarify this. Like, yes, there have been like ongoing concerns with regards to how Israel is using Palestine, okay, as or the territory as a laboratory to test its own technologies, okay, and this was very famous in Lowenstein's book on named laboratory thesis, as one of the participants here mentioned, in which he traces the development of Israel military and digital surveillance technologies from when they were first used against the Palestinians in the occupied territory to their eventual export worldwide. Okay, and here it has been reported several times is that during the Gaza war, Israel has been using the Gaza as testing ground for its military robots. Okay, in fact, there is a growing recognition that between scholars and civil society activists that the occupation and subjugation of the territories, the Palestinian territories, is crucial to Israel's national identity as a technological superpowers. Okay, so as one scholar mentioned that you can't separate Israel's achievement in AI and cybersecurity from its occupation of Palestine. And as James and Anwar mentioned, this is not just the case in Gaza, or Ukraine also have become testing grounds. But the difference, as James mentioned, is that this is a case of war, this is a case of occupation. And yes, Ukraine has been also a testing ground for AI-powered weapons. Yes, it's a lab, but it's a different kind of lab and different kind of implications.
Thank you so much, Basant. That's fantastic, right? So now, I mean, we still have time for Q&A. We've got some questions that I want to ask the panelists coming up, but if you have any more questions, please use the Q&A tab. We've had some questions coming in, and our panelists have actually answered some of them, which is great. Thank you, James and Basant, for that. And also, I think for one of the first questions, which is about artificial intelligence, rivalries between China and the West, that might be addressed actually in the next question I have towards James, which is focusing on the GCC, but it doesn't have to, James, if you don't want to focus on the GCC. But the question really is about technology and the sort of rivalry now we see between the China and the West, for want of a less reductionist term. But what challenges do countries in the region, say the GCC or the Middle East, face in coordinating their cybersecurity responses, given the overlap between national organizations and varying relationships with international technology providers like Huawei and Western companies? I mean, we've seen some of these kind of tensions about who's using whose technology play out in Europe. How is it playing out, do you think, in the GCC and the wider Middle East?
And the best place to start this answer is really on what's happening to cybersecurity overall, right? We've already talked about how cybersecurity is going from the network layer to the content layer, right? We're worried about disinformation and influence and like online safety and things like that. Cybersecurity is also going down from the network layer to the hardware layer, right? Whose chips are you integrating into your networks? Whose routers are you buying with those chips in them? Whose cables are you laying, as Bassam explained from our paper as well, right? So this upwards and downwards movement of cybersecurity means that states are taking steps justified by national security and national security concerns about potential espionage and potential disruption, especially in the case of conflict, right? This is the worries about the US saying, well, what happens in Taiwan, right? If there's a conflict in Taiwan, how can the US respond? What is the pre-positioning happening there, right? So this is a context in which the Gulf states are thinking, okay, well, where do we make our hardware, our cloud, our cyber investments, and how do we grow these sectors? Because especially when you think about AI and cloud, these are going to be foundational technologies for all digital economies, right? So you can't not invest in them, but you have to make hard geopolitical choices when you do invest in them, right? Because the more you have a US positioning itself as saying, well, it's either clean networks, right? And clean networks is a US term for a non-Chinese provider. They're not necessarily US ones, but they're mainly European ones.
Yeah.
Because there's no equivalent US other than Cisco. And you have to like participate in this clean network initiative, or you have to go to China instead, right? And this extends even to investments. So you have a very well-known AI and actually originally kind of cyber surveillance company, G42, in the UAE, right? They were working very closely with Chinese researchers and Chinese companies. They get a massive investment in their AI research and commercial investments from Microsoft, right? Facilitated by the US state, with a condition that they no longer engage with their Chinese side, right? So it's kind of like a black and white choice.
Right.
Now, that is happening because AI is seen as this big national security issue, right? And we see that in the US all the time. But it's harder to implement across the digital stack, right? You're not seeing all these mobile telecoms companies, all these sort of more less high profile sectors disengaging from China. Exactly the opposite, right? You see things like Chinese companies investing in infrastructure, in ports infrastructure, in oil and gas infrastructure, in telecoms infrastructure across the GCC and more widely in the Horn of Africa and across North Africa, right? It's a major strategic interest for them as well. So the dividing line, right, which originally was, okay, the Gulf states are military and security allies of the US, right, and economic partners for the rest of the world, right? And this includes the BRICS Forum, right? And you have Saudi Arabia joining this non-US, non-Western led consortium as well. That division between the military and security alliances and the economic partnership, now that both the West, in quotation marks, especially the US, and China sees military security and geoeconomics as massively overlapping, that division is not as easy to sustain in the future. So you have this very hard point where you have to decide between the two sort of major poles on the globe, but also regionally as well. And I don't want to underplay this sort of intra-GCC competition, right? You have Saudi Arabia, you have the UAE, you have Saudi pushing for digital companies and others to headquarter there, to try and attract investment, to try and attract tourism and everything else from the UAE and from other parts of the GCC as well. So this sort of global competition is also playing out at the intra-GCC level as well.
I mean, just as a point on the digital lubrication, and this, I mean, this goes to all panelists, but James, I mean, you're talking about Basant and Anwar, if you want to pitch in on this. I mean, you talked about, are there limits then to this digital lubrication in the sense that to what extent might it be impossible? I know not necessarily in terms of spyware or cybersecurity ware, but hardware to enable, for digital recognition to occur via the distribution of or trade of digital hardware if there are these potential black and white lines between you're either with the Chinese or with the West. I mean, are there limits then to your theory of digital lubrication, or is this something slightly different?
No, that is a clear limit, right? The other word we use often is homogenization, right? We say, okay, if you want to participate in global cloud or digital markets, you have to play the game right. You have to have the people with the right skills and the right knowledge and the right training, and you have the right hardware, that kind of thing, right? Insofar as you have to homogenize to participate in a single global digital economy, then our thesis of lubrication works pretty well. As soon as when there's more of a decoupling, right? There's actually two digital economies that have very little interaction between them, right? You're either on a Chinese tech ecosystem or a US tech ecosystem, then actually there's not very much modernization, right? You can either participate in one or the other. You're not going to participate in both. So that is a clear limit, I think, to the mechanisms that we outline in the article.
Okay, well, really interesting. So we're not going to see lube wars just yet, hopefully. Basant, is there anything you want to add to that again, since you wrote, or Anwar after Basant, maybe? Basant, please.
Yes, no, I just want to add on the point of the geopolitical competition between the US, in the context of the Sino-American rivalry when it comes to artificial intelligence in the region. And I want to just highlight this competition when it comes to artificial intelligence in the military domain. And what we're seeing is that there is an increase, as we mentioned before, the digital and the cyber objectives forced new geopolitical cooperation and competition dynamics. In this regard, we've seen that the increasing purchase of Chinese technologies in the military domain, okay, not only because Chinese system is highly advanced, but also because it's open source. Its deep reinforcement learning missile control system are available on GitHub, for example. And this has two effects, okay? First, it provides a lot of Middle Eastern states with the ability to even in the future develop their own drones. Second, it diminishes some of the potential leverage the US has as the main arms provider in the region, okay? Thereby undermining its strategy and its reputation as the primary security provider. And this is something very important now with the statements of the US regarding the, forced displacement of Palestinians going in neighboring countries. Even we've heard Netanyahu talking about having home in Saudi Arabia for them. Okay, this is something that in terms of when Saudi Arabia decides that I'm not gonna do a normalization, go with the normalization because of this outrageous statements, maybe I can have an alternative as a digital security provider. I have Russia and I have China, for example, okay? And this is something that we can look at. And in fact, actually, many of the countries in the region, they started expressing interest in buying Chinese drones, for example, like Saudi Arabia, like UAE and Egypt at the same time. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, thank you so much, Basant. And we're going to come back to you in a second, Basant, because we're going to go on the home stretch with something that will answer a lot of the questions we've been getting, was, but what can we do to fix everything? Nothing. Well, so I just wanted to ask though, Anwar, do you have anything that you want to add on to the previous points?
Thank you. I think Professor James, Shrins, and Bassam have made it clear. Of course, it's essential to understand the shift in the global power and geopolitical system from a unipolar to a multipolar system. So I think it's essential to have also alternatives in this issue. But I'm really concerned about human rights in applying of all of this geopolitics interest and common interest when it comes to the AI use of tools and mechanisms. So I think we should be working more on drafting resolutions and also conventions that align in this aspect as well. But I think it's all clear. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Anwar. I think we could even do a specific panel on human rights and cybersecurity. I think there's a really interesting discussion to be had there. Thanks. And well, I think we're coming into our final question, which brings us to Basant. You're going to take us on the home stretch, but there might be a couple of minutes if anyone wants to put in any final remarks. And I think this will answer a couple of the questions we've had about Turkey and small states, which is essentially, what concrete steps can Middle Eastern countries take to strengthen their cybersecurity against evolving threats? Basant, what would you say to that?
Okay, Mark.
No pressure.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I said no
Yeah.
pressure. I mean, you've
Okay.
got to basically protect now the Middle East from cybersecurity threats. That's your responsibility.
Yeah. Okay. So the overarching goal or the main step, one big step, is for the countries in the Middle East to develop their own technological know-how and strengthen their capabilities while at the same time maintain digital sovereignty. Okay. And to do that, they need to have a comprehensive digital policy, a policy that involves all of the stakeholders, from governments, from all sectors of the governments, including the military sectors, of course, the technology companies, and civil society actors, and this includes the public-private partnership. This is necessary to have an effective digital security design, to have an effective policy and governance. This policy should include several steps. The first step and the basic step is to increase your cybersecurity expertise. This is basically to invest in cybersecurity and AI education in schools and in higher education in universities, and also digital legal education in cyber and AI research and development. And this could be done by having joint educational programs with technology companies and civil society. And I think maybe James can later add on that what they do at Virtual Roots is that they cooperate with Google in providing educational programs to the young talents. And this is something very fascinating. Maybe James can elaborate more on what they're doing with Virtual Roots. The second step is to invest in digital startups by providing financial incentives for the young cyber talents. So, for example, by funding them, okay, or providing them tax incentives to encourage them to invest more in the digital sectors. This is important because in many countries in the Middle East, other than the Gulf, okay, the economic conditions and the low salaries in these countries actually push most of the digital talents and the expertise to work outside of the countries or even outside of the region as a whole. This comes with having a better regulatory business environment that has less bureaucratic mechanisms. In some countries in the Middle East, we have a regulatory framework and business environment that is actually crippling for digital startups, okay, with high customs arrangements to import devices or imposing on them high taxes, and of course the excessive bureaucracy. But we should take into consideration that regulation here should not be excessively restrictive that result in those companies or those young startups. They focus so much on compliance rather than focusing on delivering innovative products. Okay, and also the countries, they need to look at these regulations should stimulate competition in order to avoid public monopolies, okay, and to open the tech market for both public and private operators, of course, with regulatory mechanism to manage this an anti-competitive behavior. In this regard, digital policy and governance should have a wider perspective to cross-cut all the different sectors of the government and across various issues from education, from data protection and privacy, cybersecurity, taxation, women, health, and so on, and not only to focus on the telecom or the technology sector. And this will help coordinating and the sharing of essential infrastructure across institutions. The other step that the countries can do and that they are actually doing is to engage in joint regional, bilateral, or multilateral military cybersecurity training exercises to build the capabilities of their military personnel through sharing their expertise, especially when it comes to artificial intelligence and cyber defense capabilities. Also, another step is maybe to develop national and regional multilateral dialogues and forums. And this is something that the Gulf started to do and Egypt also started to do, to include conversations on shaping the norms of state responsibility in the cyber domain. And I believe like Saudi Arabia was one of the initiators in these kind of dialogues. And here also we need to have, when it comes to regulation, a better and up-to-date joint or common Middle Eastern cyber and AI regulations, because it's difficult to use only your national laws and regulations alone to achieve a secured cyber domain and to have cybersecurity when technological threats are transnational. Okay, so you need to have a common regulatory mechanism. And this should include clear guidance for individuals, from businesses, and from companies. The last point that I will mention is to have a multilateral or bilateral cooperation on cyber defense capabilities on the level of organizations. And here I mean maybe probably exchange information and shared expertise between the national computer emergency response teams of these countries. And maybe we can establish something like a joint Middle Eastern computer emergency response teams, like similar to what the GCC did. They have the common CERT. Okay, so why not to have our regional computer emergency response team? This will enhance our resilience, cyber resilience, and cyber capabilities and defense capabilities.
Basant, that was great and bang on time. If anyone wants to add anything in the next 30 seconds, James or Anwar, do you have anything you want to add before we finish?
2 words.
Sure.
The program that Basant mentioned, that Virtual Roots is running, is all about local communities. States have a lot of resources and ability to protect the high end, the critical infrastructure, and the national security. There's much less focus on the vulnerable and local community organizations that are actually facing just as many cyber threats.
And I think that seems super important, especially when we look at the content level of this strategy. Thank you, James. Anwar, is there anything you'd like to say before we finish?
Thank you for hosting this webinar. It's really amazing. Personally, I've learned a lot, and I really hope that we follow up with all of the questions that were added to the research, and I'm really looking forward to next steps.
Thank you. Well, I want to just thank our panel for an absolutely fascinating conversation. We've had Bassant Hassib, who's an assistant professor, University of London branch in Egypt, James Shire, the co-director of Virtual Roots, and Anwar Reis, who's the PhD researcher at Nişantaşı University in Istanbul. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to our audience, and thank you very much for your questions. Hopefully see you soon, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.